Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Woodburn Accountants and Advisors webinar series on how to lead a team in China. Do you have a high turnover of employees in China? Are you having problems in implementing your company's philosophy and culture? Are you having issues in finding the right people for your organization? Are you adapting to the Chinese culture? Woodburn Accountants and Advisors is offering this complimentary webinar series on this subject. And we hope that by the end of tomorrow's session, you will be able to have information and tools to enrich your China business skills and enhance your market entry efforts. Before we begin today's session, however, I would just like to go through a little bit of bureaucracy. The use of a VPN, it may be required, particularly by those people that are based in China. I'm currently also on a VPN, and as is very common with webinars that are on a Wi-Fi system, there could be some technical issues along the way. Please don't leave the webinar session. It usually does take about 30 seconds to 1 minute for the system to stabilize, and that we can then continue with the content. Once you've launched into the session, you'll be prompted to set up your audio system. Generally, it is automatically set up via your mic and speakers, either on your tablet, mobile, or computer. If the sound system doesn't improve through today's presentation, you may want to switch to a landline. You have the option of clicking the telephone button, and there will be a dial-in number, access code, and an audio pin. Please don't be shy. We do always try to go through a question period. However, as there is no moderator for today's session, we may not have either the time or the ability to go through it. But this should not prevent you from adding any questions or comments into the questions section of the control panel. At the end of today's session, if there are questions, I'll try and answer you immediately. Otherwise, I'll be sending you an email following today's session. So let's try and test the system. If you could click on the hand button within your control panel, that will allow me to know that you can hear me. If you could then unclick it, then the hand button will disappear. Thank you all for those of you that have clicked it. So let's begin today's session. I see a lot of familiar faces or names from the previous webinars, but for those of you that are new, just allow me to introduce who we are. Woodburn Accountants and Advisors is specialized in inbound investment into China and Hong Kong. We establish, administer, and manage companies in both jurisdictions to meet our clients' specific requirements. Everything from market entry advisory to cross-border investment, tax optimization, ongoing accounting and tax, payroll services, as well as corporate restructuring. Our clients are all focused on inbound Asian investments. And they are doing a variety of things, all the way from producing in China, selling into China, exporting from China, offering a variety of services within China. And our clients range from startups to small, medium-sized companies, and we're also working with a few multinationals and publicly listed firms. As a minor disclaimer, today's topic is how to employ talent in China. This presentation is a general overview on how to do that. Obviously, it will depend on the sector, the industry, the type of candidates you're looking to employ, etc. And if you've got any specific questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Christina Kohler-Coluccia. I'm the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. I've been in this sector and industry since 2003, so about 16 years on the market, doing corporate services for foreign investors who are either entering or expanding within the Chinese territory. The aim of these webinar series is really to educate and inform people about the ongoing regulations and the ways of doing business in China. One of the things that I tend to see with a lot of foreign investors is the fear of entering this market, the unknowns that exist in this market. And I don't want to say necessarily the instability, but the fact that laws and regulations are not necessarily black and white. So the aim is to clear up and provide a bit of a transparent overview in terms of how things work in China. So let's begin today's presentation. The topic for today is how to employ talent in China. And it starts all the way from finding the right people, picking the right candidates, understanding how to do interview processes, and then actually getting these individuals settled and properly employed within your organization. So that's looking obviously at employment laws, contracts, handbooks, social insurance requirements, income tax requirements, and last but not least, something that a lot of people forget about, which is helping employees settle into the organization. I want to start off today's presentation by looking at a couple of case studies of how things have gone wrong with different clients. The first case study is looking at high turnover of corporate management. So we had a client out of Canada. They incorporated a company in China, and basically within the first 2 years of operation, they had spent over 80,000 renminbi that they hadn't budgeted for on lawyers' fees in order to change the internal structure of the company. And this is everything from board of directors to legal representatives to general managers. And what caused this disruption was the fact that within that 2-year period, they had consistent and constant turnover in terms of resignations or terminations within their head office, which then resulted as a kind of like an overflow effect occurring within their Chinese company. So just this alone, if you look at corporate management roles, it's truly important that you find the right people to appoint when you're establishing your business in China. Because if you have such a turnover, it doesn't bode well for the employees you're looking to hire on the ground in China, right? There's too much for them instability that's occurring already with the senior management. The second case study is looking at termination of individuals in the corporate structure. And corporate structure is referring to people, again, as I mentioned, that are either in the board of directors, they are an executive director, they're the legal representative, or for example, they're also the general manager. This was a small, medium-sized company in Italy that had established a company in China for quite some time. They had a legal representative who was Italian and who also relocated to China to be based in Shanghai to operate their business. The legal representative was also appointed as the general manager. Then, just due to poor performance, they terminated the legal representative as well as the general manager roles. And they forgot that he had been appointed in such a role. And the issue is when you're operating your organization, if you want to change anything, you want to increase capital, you do require the signature of the legal rep. And the legal rep is somebody that is entered within the computer systems of the various government bureaus. His signature is registered as well as passport copies. So it became very difficult to operate when suddenly they wanted to increase capital and they had no working funds available on the ground. Now, because the termination wasn't friendly, it was a pretty bad termination, the legal rep refused to do anything as a favor for the company. And as a result, they couldn't do any of the applications they needed to get money on the ground. Now, one of the things that I tried to do, just because I was thinking outside of the box, was telling the government bureau that actually the legal rep had died, and hence, as a consequence, we couldn't get his signature and there had to be a replacement and whatnot, and to see whether actually one of the board members could sign off on these documents. And when I proposed that, the government officer actually said, we want to see the death certificate of the legal rep. So with all of these government roles, I mean, you know, they do ask for all the follow-up documentation if you do say something. So it is very important to remember, if you've appointed someone in any of the management roles, to understand what obligations they have, what responsibilities they have. Obviously, if they are in such a role where you then need changes to be made within your organization, you've got to have a backup plan in order to get, you know, your operation continuing. So one tip that we would sometimes offer is people that are in managerial roles, that they sign off on documents, on plain pieces of documents, so that in case anything has to happen later on and they've been fired or terminated, you at least have something with their signature that you can use to continue your operation in China. The third case study is looking at companies that have no replacements for individuals within the corporate structure. And I'm focusing here a little bit more on senior managerial roles because turmoil and instability is generally caused when there is no stability in your upper hierarchy. So in this situation, we had a client that was a US company. They had incorporated a China subsidiary. Their legal representative was the appointed head of Asia Pacific operations, which was a very logical choice. But lo and behold, after a couple of years, he resigned and he moved on to a new company. And the issue was that for a year and a half, the company could not appoint a single replacement. And quite honestly, we don't understand from Woodburn's perspective what was actually going on in the head office that they couldn't find a replacement. But this person who had resigned from the organization, was no longer working in the organization, in the end threatened to sue the company for not removing himself, because if you are in a legal rep role, you are the legal face of the company. So he did have a certain level of responsibility. And in his new role, also as head of Asia Pacific, he had to travel to China. So there was no opportunity for him to get his name, on a blacklist or anything like that. The minute that he threatened to sue, he actually pushed the company to make a decision on a replacement. But it is very important for a company, especially the head office, to know exactly what is required, when replacements are needed, and to kind of have backup plans that are occurring. The last case study is something that I actually did highlight in one of the earlier sessions this week in terms of terminating staff. And it's all about the personal relationship building that you have to do with the staff. So we had a client that actually terminated a staff member following the regulations that they usually follow through their Hong Kong company. And we've got to face it, Hong Kong is not China. China is not Singapore, China is not Germany. It has its own sets of regulations and rules in terms of how you can terminate staff. And the issue in this scenario was the fact that the staff member lost face. They were completely shocked and taken off guard by the termination. They didn't also agree with the reasons behind the termination. And as a consequence, they lost face. They asked for an extremely large payout, which the company didn't expect and actually didn't know how to deal with. And as a consequence, because they did it on a Friday night, they had no way of reaching their lawyer, they actually paid out a compensation of 70,000 renminbi, which is a ridiculous amount in consideration, because they just wanted to get rid of the staff member. Both sides were basically taken off guard. So anytime that you want to terminate someone, it's extremely critical that you have the concept of knowledge is power. The more you know, the better off you're going to be in a situation. What this company should have done was, prior to terminating a staff member, contact the lawyer about what the labor regulations state, ask the lawyer whether the reasons for termination that they were going to give were valid and true reasons according to the labor law. And worst case scenario, depending on the seniority of the person they were looking to terminate, ask the lawyer to join in that meeting so that they would never be taken off guard and they wouldn't have to pay out large sums of money that actually they haven't budgeted for in order to be able to terminate. So I've started off today's presentation in a very negative light, primarily because I want to show what can occur in China if you don't pay attention to your business, and the amounts of money that you can spend that are outside of your budget that can threaten your ongoing operation. So let's start off with the concept of how to employ talent. Well, the first step is obviously finding the right talent. And the biggest question you have to ask yourself is, well, who is out there? The China labor market is extremely rich as it is varied, and it certainly does lack in certain industries and sectors. Highly skilled workers and specialists in certain industries are just underrepresented. So you've got to keep this in mind during your search, and don't just settle on a candidate because it's the only one you've been able to find or interview, okay? If they don't meet your criteria, they should already be crossed off your list. So obviously, to get help, you can use local job search portals like 51job.com, China HR, Jiaopin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, whereby you can do the search yourself. There are filtering options on all of these sites. You can then obtain the resumes, contact people directly, and ask if they're interested in switching jobs, or alternatively, if they're interested in working for your company. But basically, that means you're doing all the work yourself. The second option is obviously using recruiters and headhunters where you give them a profile of what you're looking for, the skill set that you're looking for, and then they help to go out there. Maybe they already have a database available where they reach out to people. The advantage, obviously, of using a recruiter and headhunter is the fact that they do all the work for you. They do the filtering, and they leave you with a short list of maybe 3 to 5 candidates that in the end of the day you interview. So it saves a lot of time in terms of focusing on all of this. The most important aspect I can say, and again, it's related to knowledge is power, is do your research. If you just search on Google or on Baidu salary guidelines for China, you will come up with a bunch of different salary guidelines that have been issued by a variety of different recruitment firms, where you can understand salary levels, you can understand the types of titles that are being used for positions and roles, you can understand lengths of education, periods of education, working experience, etc. And it gives you insight into what you're probably looking for. So do a little bit of research yourself, just again through Baidu, online research that will help you to find the right talent. The next step is obviously picking the right candidate. So there are 2 key parts to this process. Candidates must be screened for both aptitude and attitude, as well as language capabilities, right? Particularly if you're looking for someone who's bilingual or trilingual. Generally, on the market, people are looking for individuals that speak at least Mandarin as well as fluent English. But I know a lot of European clients that are also looking, for example, for German speakers, Spanish speakers, Italian speakers, etc. The most effective way to tackle this is to create your own checklist. Note down the key skills that the right candidate must have, and then tick them off as you review your application. Any candidates who pass this stage can then be invited for an interview, where then you can test for attitude. And this needs to be really carefully examined. So for me, for example, if someone comes into the meeting room and they don't put their bag down and they don't take off their jacket, that's a sign that they're not relaxed, which could be very much in relation to nerves. I always try to make people feel relaxed and say, put your bag down, take your jacket off. If you feel things are not improving, end the interview. If there's just no, match in that first 10, 15 minutes, nobody's forcing you to continue an interview. I know a lot of people who then end up still sitting in the room for an hour and just get frustrated. If it's not working out well, just terminate the interview and tell the person this isn't the right fit. Just remember about also your demeanor. Remember also their demeanor. If the interview is being held in English, English might not be their first language. They might act in a very direct manner. They might be harsh. They might be brash. You've got to figure out with their attitude whether that fits what you're looking for in the individual. Keep in mind when you're interviewing people that this person will have to work with you day in and day out. Not just with you, but also with the team members that you've already hired, whether they're based in the headquarters or whether they're based in your China operation. So it's important to find really the right candidate that fits within the team dynamic. So when you are, so here's just a bit of a continuation from the previous slide in terms of picking the right candidates, looking at the aptitude, the attitude, the language capabilities, etc. I've also listed here a couple of questions that I ask. I ask them in different formats depending on the role. I've just put here an example as an operations manager, some questions that I ask. Now you might think that these questions are very standardized. They are. I mean, these are questions I would probably ask anyone wherever they would be based. But it's funny that when I see a lot of foreigners HR professionals coming into the market trying to interview people, they get lost in terms of what interview questions to ask, primarily because the other person's English is not great. And then they lose track of what should be asked. So I've just listed a couple of things here that can be used as a tip when you're going through an interview process. But I think one of the most critical things, especially in people that you're interviewing for that are higher up in the hierarchy, is ask them to complete a project. So if you've gone them, you like the resume, you've done the interview, and you've got a good feeling about them, the last step should be asking them to do a small project for you. One, this will show you their interest level, because depending on how well they do that project, how well they present it, you know, they could either be very keen or really not that interested in your organization. But one of the things that I ask, and this is regardless of the role, I tell them, when you start in my organization, can you give me an action plan? What will be your action plan for the first 3 to 6 months of joining my firm? And it's up to them. They can create a PowerPoint presentation, they can create a Word document, but the idea is that in the next second round interview, you are going through their thought process of what they would like and what they are planning on doing upon entering the company, okay? So if, for example, you're hiring a sales guy, what would be his sales action plan? Would he need training? Regarding products, services, does he want to meet the head office? Usually it's a really good sign if they want to travel abroad and actually network with the sales teams over there to learn from them. And it doesn't even have to be a long trip, it could be a 2 to 3 day business trip, but it shows insight into how they're thinking. Then, you know, who do they want to meet? Do they want to meet distributors? Do they want to meet end clients? What type of distributors? Do they have a network already to distributors? Can they list a couple of distributors they would approach based on their past experience? Do they have a list of end clients? Going through this type of project and presentation really will help you to understand their thought process in terms of starting off with a new organization. And you know, once you've seen 2 to 3 people give you this type of project, this will help you to also understand who fits in your organization, who you like, who you think can fit well from a thought point of view within your organization. And it just helps to narrow down the field to that top candidate. So ultimately, you know, you're down to 3 candidates. You finally found your candidate that you want, and you have to now give him an offer letter. Okay, that's usually how it works. You give him an offer letter based on salary levels and whatever benefits and allowances that this individual will obtain. What is important at this stage is to understand what the employment laws are regarding that type of role. So for example, if they're in a sales role, then most probably they'll earn commissions. So you'll want to know what is the norm in the Chinese market. Do people earn no base salary and just commission? Do people have to earn a certain base salary and then they get commission? How often is commission paid out? You've got to know what is the norm in order to be able to attract that employee to come and work for you. One of the things that we had discovered doing an internal audit of a client of ours in Shanghai was that as the business's performance was not doing well, and they didn't want to terminate anyone because they knew and had projected that business was going to go up again, they decided to keep all the staff. And what they did, without checking, was they told the staff members, we're going to keep all of you, but we're going to actually reduce your base salary. Now, by law in China, you are not permitted to reduce anybody's base salary. Okay, if you have started off your negotiations and your relationship with one base salary, you can't go under it unless the role and responsibility has changed. But if the role and responsibility and the title has all remained the same, you can't decrease the base salary. You can maybe negotiate on the commission rate, but you can't decrease the base. And when we had seen that, that for us was a huge red flag to warn the company that if at any point they fired someone, that employee would have every right to go to the Labor Arbitration Committee and file a complaint. So you've got to understand what the rules and regulations are in terms of setting up your employment contract. and understanding, what's needed. The most important aspect, and maybe this sounds absolutely ridiculous, is the fact that you do need to draw up an employment contract. The amount of people that go to China and do everything just via email and assume that then the email is the agreement is wrong. You need an employment contract. It should be based on PRC law. It is a requirement to have an employment contract. If the employee doesn't sign an employment contract, they can ask for a penalty from the Labor Arbitration Committee that has to be paid, and actually it would be double the salary amount that has to be owed until an employment contract is signed. You've got to know what the employment contract covers, okay? Everything from termination clauses to standard of conduct, to non-competition, to intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You've got to also know that there are standard hours that are regulated in China, but you can also apply for flexible working hour contracts, but they need to be applied for, okay? You've also got to understand that contracts can be either limited or unlimited, meaning you can have a 1-year contract, you can have a 5-year contract, or you can have an open-ended contract. By law, you can only have signed 2 limited contracts, and the 3rd contract with that employee will have to be open-ended. Now, a lot of people, especially when they've just entered the Chinese market, are extremely anti-paying for getting an employee handbook template. I find employee handbooks critical because one of the things that they outline are the procedures if a employee has done something wrong, i.e. they've received a gift from a client that they shouldn't have received, et cetera, et cetera. In the employee handbooks, you have different phases of when warning letters can be issued and ultimately what is considered to be a full-on termination. If you have an employee sign a handbook, it means they are fully aware of the company's policies and guidelines in relation to termination. There are a bunch of other guidelines and rules within the employee handbook, but really what is critical is when you want to terminate staff, right? And you don't want to terminate someone that they lose face and take revenge on your company. You want to make sure that over time you've issued warning letters. And for example, one of the rules of thumb might be that if you get 3 warning letters, that leads on to a termination, right? So you do want to have these types of employee handbooks. I truly understand that companies might not want to pay for such a template when they set up their company because they're on a very, very tight budget and they feel like with only 1 staff or 2 staff, it's not necessary. You can always add an employee handbook later on. It's not the method I would recommend, but most certainly you can do that. But at some point as your business grows, you should definitely have these employee handbooks on hand in case of the termination aspect. In addition to that, if you want to retain staff, you want to be able to give them a lot of transparency. So if they get a handbook, understanding what the rules and policies are and guidelines within your company, like for example, having travel expense budgets, meal expense budgets if they take out clients, whatever the case might be, then they have it in their handbook. It's all transparent. They've known that from day one and they can't venture out. You've got these guidelines and policies in place. It truly helps staff members to have this transparency because they know that they feel safe and stable within your organization because they know that there's nothing that's going to come out as a shock at a later stage. Now, when you draw up the employment contracts and you negotiate the salaries, one of the things that you should definitely not forget to budget for are the social insurance requirements that are in China. Now, I just want to highlight a case study here. We had a client who did not set up a company in China. What they did is they utilized one of their suppliers to hire 5 employees. Now, the hiring didn't happen overnight. It happened over periods where this supplier hired the first guy, eventually the second, and as the business grew, they hired 5 people, all who were chosen by my client. And they were using this supplier in order to handle the entire payroll system, everything from paying net salary, handling social insurances, housing funds, paying personal income tax, etc. Now, when one of the staff members of my client traveled to China to visit the office, meet the staff, and do a business trip with a couple of the staff members, he discovered that one of these firefighters had broken his leg on duty during a work project. And he was going around the entire office of the supplier to ask for money, to ask for assistance. And then he asked one of the other members of the team, you know, why is he going around asking for money? Doesn't the social insurance pay for everything? And finally, it came about that the supplier had not been paying for any social insurance to the labor bureaus, none, which means that these 5 employees got no medical insurance, they got no accidental work insurance, which is what this gentleman should have received, no maternity insurance, nothing, and they had not been paying into their pension fund. Now, this is something that's critical because it is absolutely illegal to do that. If you are European or American, you and your company are all contributing into your pension funds, right? In the US, it's a 401k. In Germany and in different European jurisdictions, you will have different types of pension funds, and the company contributes as well as the employee contributes. You're also offered potentially medical insurance, or by the state, you are offered different forms of medical insurances. Can you imagine hiring people on the ground in China who don't get these benefits that actually they should be obtaining? It is critical that you offer this type of social insurance. And it's also critical that you know that there is this type of social insurance available to the employees. Now, social insurances in China vary depending on where you're located. The highest rates are applicable in Shanghai because Shanghai has the highest standard of living in China. The rates will vary depending, it'll be cheaper wherever else you go. Shanghai has the highest rates. The rates are capped on a specific salary level, which changes on an annual basis, looking again at know what the rates are, to calculate these rates, to budget for these rates, and to pay for these rates. The laws and regulations have also been updated, making it very, very strict on employers that these social insurance rates are being paid. So you've got to be very careful with the calculations because the tax bureaus will spot any short payments that are being made. You've got to make sure that contributions for dispatched employees as well as low-cost workers, so production workers, is all paid for. If you, every single individual in China has a hukou, which is basically their, originally it is where they are born. Hukous can be moved depending if they have resided in a certain city for a certain period of time. So, there's a lot of immigration occurring into Shanghai of people from tier 2, tier 3 cities. And if they've lived in Shanghai in a certain period of time, they can change their hukou status to being Shanghai. It's important to know where employees are registered. You've got to make sure that you're using the rates based on where they're being located. So if they haven't changed their hukou status, then you will have Shanghai rates for hukou status, Shanghai rates for non-hukou status. It's very important that all the social insurances are paid on time, that there are absolutely no delays. In addition, you should be aware that if payment is not made or there's an underpayment that is made, one of the worst scenarios that could occur is the tax bureau puts a freeze on your corporate accounts, which means you won't have access to use your corporate accounts at all in terms of receiving funds or paying out funds. So social insurance definitely, from my perspective, all these new regulations that have come out in 2018, 2019 are positive. I appreciate them. I think they're great because everyone deserves to have the social insurance that is owed to them. The next thing that you have to think about is the individual income tax. And there has been a reform that has taken place and has begun on January 1st, 2019. The new individual income tax rates and processes have all been updated. They are different than they were before. It's important to be able to understand when you're negotiating with an individual, whether it's a foreigner who's going to be residing in China or whether it's a local mainland Chinese, what their tax burden is going to be. There's a lot of details to go through in terms of the individual tax, income tax reform, but I just kind of wanted to minimize it here to say, you know, when you are employing staff, this is a critical point that you have to go through. I've added here 3 important points. One is the fact that previously income tax in China was paid on a monthly basis. Nowadays, you have to declare it on an annual basis. However, for the next 3 years, there is a type of gradual implementation process whereby in some cities you are required to declare the monthly income tax but set aside the funds, meaning the funds are not actually paid. In some cases, you still pay the funds and then there'll be an annual review to see if there's a plus or minus in terms of the annual total amount. Or in some cities that are a little bit more advanced, you just will declare it on an annual basis now. The annual income should include everything from salaries, wages, income, royalty income, commissions, bonuses. If you have purchased a property in China, the rental income, I mean, everything that is not just salary related should be involved in here. So if you have external income that you're earning outside of the company, this is something that you would then declare on an annual basis. Another big change has been the fact that when you have a gross salary, you are provided a standard deduction. And the rates were different for mainland Chinese employees as well as foreigners. They were completely different, and now they're unified. So for every single person that is residing in China, that is earning a salary from a Chinese company, they get a standard deduction of 5,000 renminbi. So if you're earning a monthly salary of 30,000 renminbi, your taxable amount is based on 25,000 instead of the 30,000. They have now also new tax brackets based on the annual concept. This is, for a lot of us, still very hard to read through and understand because we've always worked on a monthly basis. So in order for people to understand it a bit better, I've also added the monthly table corresponding to the new annual table to understand a little bit better how it all works. But basically, with these new tax brackets that have been issued, there is a tax relief on individuals with low and medium income since the range of 3%, 10%, and 20% have been expanded. So this is a huge benefit for people that are earning salaries in the 20% and under tax brackets. The 25% tax bracket has been narrowed, which could seem positive for those earning 300,000 renminbi or less, but it could affect people who are earning more than 300,000. And the tax brackets for people that were in the 30% range and above, this is all remained as usual. So really the only people that have been affected by these change in these tax brackets are those that are earning somewhere between 300,000 and 420,000 renminbi per annum, where ultimately their tax liability could be higher. But ultimately, it's a great change for, it's either a great change or no change at all for everybody else. In order to be able to explain to you how you calculate the taxes, I've kind of given a word explanation here, but I've also given an example. So if you're calculating your taxes, you would have, let's say, earn a salary of 19,000 renminbi. You would get a special deduction of 3,600, which is according to the table. You would get also another 5,000 renminbi deduction, which is the standard deduction being offered, which means that you have a taxable income based on 10,400 renminbi versus the 19,000. When looking at the 10,400 renminbi, you look at the tax table again, you look under which category it falls under. Here it falls under 10%. You have another then deduction of 210, and then ultimately you're earning you have a tax liability of 830 renminbi. So you can see in this scenario, you're really not paying that much money in terms of tax based on the 19,000. It has certainly reduced compared to the past. The last item I want to touch on is particularly pertaining to foreigners, and I get questions on this a lot. If you are deciding to employ a foreigner in China, and foreigners can also encompass people that are from Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan, then you need to be able to provide a visa. For people that are from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Macau, it will be a different type of application and related visa. But for those that are European, American, Australian, et cetera, they would apply for a Z visa, which is a working visa. Now, for me, this is something that's so important. I have not just had one client, but I've had numerous clients bring in foreigners, bring in the families of these foreigners, and not apply for the right visas. And when any denouncement is made, or when any spontaneous check is made within the company, and they realize that these foreigners don't have the right visas, they are actually detained. Not in a jail, but they are detained for a certain period of time. And in some instances, they can also be deported. So it is very important to make sure that if you are planning to have a foreigner based in China, please make sure they have the visas, particularly if they're bringing their wives and children as well. I'm very pleased because it's only been a few years now where schools have requested to see the work permits and residence visas in order to be grant permission to enter a school. This has been a huge step forward because it has forced companies now to get the right visas if the children are relocating to China as well. But it is very important. Work permit applications for foreigners has been updated as of April 1st, 2018, and it is an extremely strict process now. For me, having worked in China for the last 15 years, I've truly seen the market opening. I've truly seen things being simplified in terms of processes. There are two areas where I've seen things become more difficult. One is with banks, but this is a global phenomenon. So, nowadays, with all the know your client procedures with banks, it's becoming very difficult to either open accounts or even just handle basic operations at banks. The second is to obtain work permits and residence visas for foreigners. It is not easy. And I have seen a lot of people who've been in the Chinese market for 20 to 30 years residing in China. They have their own companies where they have recently been rejected. It's a serious issue. That's not easy. So you've got to make sure that if you are planning on bringing over any foreigners into the market, that they have the right background, that they have the right criteria, that they fall within the right grading system in order to have their visas approved and applied for. The majority of foreigners would fall under a tier B category, which basically means you need to have a university degree of at least a university degree plus at least 2 years of work experience, which means it's very difficult to get foreign interns as well as young graduates to come out to China now. Previously, this was a form of very cheap labor for multinational organizations, and now they're being restricted on bringing this type of category of people. Most foreigners will fall under this tier B category. The issue naturally for China is, if you go into the market, what do they want? They want you to hire locals. They want the majority of your employees to be locals. They want to make sure that their unemployment rate goes down. That's a wish from every country in the world, that if a foreign company goes in, they hire the locals. They don't bring in foreigners. And as a consequence, this is one of the things that China has placed the most control on. So if you are thinking about bringing foreigners in, generally they'll fall into the tier B category. Now, things that you have to think about in terms of hiring foreigners in China, most individuals already in China will have a work permit. Depending on the age of the individual, there should, in theory, be no issues. As I said, for those friends of mine that have been in the market for 25 or 30 years, that probably makes them around 50, 55, 60. They are the ones that are getting their current work permits rejected, current work permit applications rejected. You've got to understand all about the tier system now when applying for new work permits. People who have high technical skills or are in mid to senior level managerial roles should not have any issues. In addition, people with science, technology, engineering, or a math background also shouldn't have any issues. Whether they speak Mandarin or not is not an issue. It's known that a lot of foreigners who come into the market won't speak Mandarin. There might be more luck in terms of obtaining work permits if you're locating your company in central or western China, because the government has incentive plans there to promote foreign investment. Places like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen are difficult because there's a saturation of foreigners that are all based there. Fresh university graduates, interns, you're gonna have the biggest frustrations with these guys. You might find that in some free trade zones, there are beneficial policies in terms of revoking the 2-year requirement. I wouldn't count on that because there is no guarantee, but the experience has been that it's a little bit easier in order of obtaining those people. So it's important to understand, what you have to think about. So don't start interviewing foreigners if that's one of the groups of people you want to have in your company until you know that you can truly apply them based on their current background. Now, one thing I want to highlight and conclude with in today's session is, we're talking about how to employ talent in China. And everything that I have so far talked about seems extremely overwhelming in terms of the amount of knowledge that is required to learn. Everything from, how to do the interviews, what type of interview questions to ask, how to pick the right candidates, all the way to understanding labor laws, social insurance requirements, tax requirements, visa obligations, etc. That a lot of people, once they have the person on hand in the market, then they forget to actually settle the person in. This is why, as I mentioned earlier, one of the projects that I really recommend people to do is to create an action plan project for those final 3 to 5 candidates that you're interviewing. Because at least then, when the employee starts on their first day, they've already done an action plan and they know how to start their job, especially if you give them no support, okay? I have a lot of people who are basically saying, right, we've hired the guy, he's now sitting in the office, mission accomplished, we're done, now the business will roll, and I'll follow up with him once a week, once a month. You've got to follow up with him daily. You've got to really let this guy settle in, understand your company philosophy, meet and network with the various team members, whether that means sending him abroad or bringing those team members to China in order to introduce and understand what's going on. You've got to give him a little bit of guidance in relation to the vision of what you're expecting within the company. One thing is creating an action plan where you don't give him any information because you just kind of want to see what he comes up with. But once he's employed, you've got to give him a bit of background. You've got to give him a bit of vision. You've got to give goals and expectations that he's going to receive. By doing this, by helping to the person to settle in, it will also help you with the staff retention aspect because you're giving the individual direction in terms of where they're going. You're allowing them to network. You're allowing them to move around. And with the tips that I've given on the last 3 days in terms of providing trainings, learning a little bit more about the business culture and how to communicate with the staff member are really critical issues that you should take into account when trying to settle the people. So that's the end for today's presentation. We didn't get any questions that came in, so I'm guessing everything was very clear and transparent in terms of today's presentation. So we'll leave today's presentation at that. Again, as I mentioned, if you've got any questions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to assist you and guide you through the various processes. As mentioned in previous webinars, we have online free subscriptions regarding the latest legal, tax, and trade news and whatnot. We also have various social media platforms where we promote resources, so you're more than welcome to either follow myself or our corporate pages. Last but not least, we have our last webinar session tomorrow, which will be actually a different type of format. It will be myself and Manfred Steinkellner from Steinkellner China Search, where we will be having a type of discussion and debate on how to find the right people for your organization and to provide some tips in terms of what to look at when you're going through the filtering process of reading through resumes, interviewing candidates, and as mentioned, trying to do certain projects during this interview phase. So if you're interested in participating in that, please do join us for tomorrow's session. I'd like to thank everyone for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you very much and have a nice afternoon. Goodbye.